Donald Trump. Now, you've known Trump for a very long time, and you worked with him. Now, did you meet him for Celebrity Apprentice? Is that what was that like? And tell me about Mr. Trump, and let me ask you some questions if you would. So you have a very lengthy experience with him.
So I met him first on America's Got Talent. He appeared as a guest star, I think, introducing one of the shows. And I met him briefly backstage, and he was intrigued by me because he knew that Rupert Murdoch, who was somebody he greatly admired, had made me the youngest newspaper editor for 50 years. So he knew about that part of my background, and that was all he was interested in, really. It was like, oh, so Rupert, you're one of Rupert's guys, right? So that's how we had a sort of immediate early connection. Then I entered Celebrity Apprentice, which he was obviously the host of. And it was a pretty fascinating experience looking back, because night after night, I ended up winning the show pretty much by behaving how I thought Trump would want me to behave. So I read The Art of the Deal, his book, about 4 times before I went out there, and just played it tough and hard and to win, which I knew would be all traits he would find impossible to say were not good things. To the degree, actually, that when I won, his last words were, "Piers, you're arrogant, you're obnoxious, you're possibly evil, but you beat the hell out of everybody. You're my Celebrity Apprentice." When he won the presidency, I sent him the same note. Dear Donald,
right.
You're arrogant, you're obnoxious, you're possibly evil, but you beat the hell out of everybody and you're the president of the United States. So we had that little thing going. But on Celebrity Apprentice, what I remember most vividly was that he was a very different character in those boardrooms for 3 hours a night than I ever saw when he was president. When he was president, he was the ultimate alpha male, I believe, playing a role. I believe we didn't see the real Donald Trump. We saw the disagreeable side of him most of the time. The bully boy, the braggart, the alpha guy who would never apologize for anything because it's too weak. He was abusive, he was disrespectful, and so on. In the boardroom for hour after hour, he could be very heartfelt. He could be very moved by people. He could be very funny. He could be very warm. I remember all those things and thinking, what happened to that guy? Why don't you show the world any of that stuff? Because if you did, it would be incredibly disarming. So I won the show. That I then went back into Celebrity Apprentice each year as one of his boardroom advisors for a few years. Then I joined CNN, interviewed him 30, 40 times at CNN. Then he becomes the president of the United States. And suddenly I've got this guy that I've become pretty friendly with, who used to ring me every 3 or 4 weeks for a chat about life. And now he's the most powerful man in the world. From a loyalty perspective, which I think is a trait overlooked with Trump, when he became president, I rang him and I said to him, actually first I would say when I left CNN, he was one of only 3 or 4 people in America who bothered to contact me afterwards. And he contacted me every month for a few months. How are you doing? Are you okay? Can I help you? Right now, people might say he had a vested interest in case you popped back with a big job. Or maybe, but so did lots of people. And he was one of only a handful of people that bothered to actually contact me regularly to check I was okay and could he help. I never forgot that. Similarly, when he won the presidency, I rang him and we had a chat about a week later. And I said, just one favor. Of course, champ. He used to always call me champ because I won his show. Of course, champ. What is it? I said, I just want to have your first international television interview. I know you're going to do a domestic one in America, but first international. Done. And a few months later, I was at Davos in Switzerland, a 45-minute wide-ranging interview with the President of the United States, which was spectacularly good for my career. And he kept his word. So Trump, if you were loyal to him, was very, very, very loyal back. I've fallen out with him recently because I just can't buy into all this stolen election nonsense. And I've told him to his face, and he doesn't want to hear it.
Well, I think part of the reason, I'm going to lay out some theories and you tell me if I'm wrong, okay? I think part of what happened to Trump was that tough part of him played well, especially to working class people. And I think that there was an element of that was very genuine, especially contrasted with Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, what would you call it, patronizing attitude towards working class people. Trump could speak to people directly, and he had that bluntness that disarmed them in some sense and made them believe that he was, at least in in many ways dealing an honest hand. Now, he suffered a tremendous amount of assault through vitriol when he was running for president and when he was president, probably more than any president that I can remember, including Richard Nixon, who I think might have run second for having most abuse dumped on him. And whether or not that's deserved is independent. I think in Trump's case, it was over the top in quite a remarkable way. And so I think that probably elicited more of that bullying behavior that might be perhaps a weakness. I've been trying to understand him. And the bullying, the last interview you did with him, I believe, one of the things I noted about Trump was that he would do something about every 10 minutes that was markedly out of the ordinary conversationally. And so I watch for that because I'm a clinician. And so I always watch people talk to see when they're going off script, let's say, because there's always something underneath that. And one of the things Trump does, and I don't know how much of this is conscious and how much of it is reactive and how much of it has become habitual, is he'll say utterly proper, he'll make statements that are way over the top. So I think he said, for example, when you were interviewing something like, I tell the truth more than anyone ever has in history. And then he said about 10 minutes later, something like, I've run the best administration in American history. And they're over the top, preposterous statements. And they have this self-aggrandizing element that's got a juvenile flavor to it. And I'm not doing a global critique of Trump's personality because I suspect, as you've already indicated, that he's a multifaceted person. But there's an element of him he's got this 10-year-old bully part of him that also has a compensatory element. And so to say, I tell the truth more than anyone has in history or something along those lines, I think, well, like, who are you comparing yourself here to exactly? Like, you tell the truth more than Jesus Christ. You run a better administration than Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. And it's marked because people don't generally do that in conversation, right? They don't come out with a preposterous statement about how remarkable they are with some degree of regularity. And now it seems to me to be associated with some other tendencies that he has. Like, he has a tendency to nickname people, and he has unerring accuracy in doing that, and it can be devastating. And that also reminds me of someone who's like a very professional 11-year-old bully. And a few of them can bring a teacher to their knees if their attacks are targeted. And they can certainly do that with their classmates. And so I wonder with Trump if he's pushed into a corner because of all the vitriol. The bullying and braggadocio tendency has become exaggerated. Maybe he's more surrounded by sycophants now than might be helpful. Now, I don't know that for sure, but it looks to me like something like that is happening. And he's trying to calibrate himself, even during your interview, because he comes out with these statements, something like, well, look at how wonderful I am. And I think, well, maybe if he would have got credit for some of the things that he did that were actually pretty positive, like not having America dragged into a war and like also fostering the Abraham Accords, that he wouldn't be so inclined to be compensatory in that manner. And then that bullying tendency seems to me the inverse of that is this victimization routine, which he's wandered into. Now, Trump claims the elections were stolen by corruption. And I would say part of the reason people find that credible is because the American left-wing establishment and the liberal establishment, for that matter, were unbelievably vitriolic to Trump and stooped pretty much to anything in order to devalue and criticize him, no matter how unfair and how over the top. And that generated a fair bit of sympathy on people's part. And I think it generated a sense that he was, in some global sense, treated unfairly. But I can't see that there's any legal evidence that's been compelling that he's been able to bring forth that the elections were legally conducted in an improper and corrupt manner. And so then what I see happening with Trump is that he's fallen prey to the very victimization narrative that he purports to stand against. And so he's gone off brand. It's like, well, Mr. Trump, you're the winner. You're the guy who doesn't have things stolen from him by callow fools. You're the leader of the free country. You can stand up to the dictator of North Korea and to Vladimir Putin himself. You're a winner. And that's your brand. And yet the election was stolen from you. And now your story is it was stolen and everything's corrupt and all the institutions are corrupt, which is exactly what the left-wing radicals are saying. And there's very little positive messaging tied up in that, and it's hamstringing the Republicans. And so, well, that's how it looks to me. And so I'm wondering, you know Trump very well. Am I not giving the devil his due in this situation? Am I off in my analysis in some important way?
No, I think you're spot on. And I think some interesting points you raised there. I mean, I've always thought Trump is a unique character in that he has the thickest skin of anybody I've ever seen in public life, and also the thinnest skin. So he'll react with ridiculous oversensitivity to every slight and come out punching, but he's able to withstand the kind of pressure or scandal that would engulf and destroy every other politician I've ever encountered. So he's a unique hybrid of thick and thick skin. I think that his book is very educational, The Art of the Deal. It's a really entertaining read, and actually has a lot of good business stuff in it. So I recommend people, if you just want to read it, it's quite fun. Remember, he's a real estate tycoon in Manhattan. His whole persona for 50 years before he became president was to show off, embellish, and exaggerate everything. Every one of his buildings, you can imagine the pitch. This is going to be the greatest building New York's ever seen. That was in his DNA. So it's perfectly normal for me that he would take those kind of natural traits to the presidency and continue to be self-aggrandizing in the way he was about his buildings. He'd done it for 50 years. That's how he squeezed big prices for his buildings. Everything was the best and the greatest ever seen.
Yeah. Well, that's part of that American salesman routine, right? I mean, that's deeply embedded in the American DNA.
Right. He's not the only New York real estate tycoon who's like that. Trust me, I've met a few. But I also think that he also in the book says if somebody punches you, punch them 10 times harder. Right? That was in his DNA too. Trump has come from a rough old school of New York business people where the ones who survive and thrive are the ones who, if they get hit, metaphorically or perhaps even physically, they hit back 10 times and harder. That's always been Trump's way. So if you insult him, he'll come for you hard. And if you can survive that, well, good. But many people, including all the candidates in 2016 on the Republican side, they couldn't withstand the nicknames. I mean, the nickname thing was fascinating. To watch him call Marco Rubio Little Marco, and you suddenly thought, wow, he is quite little, isn't he? Low energy Jeb, about Jeb Bush. But Bush couldn't work out whether to carry on being himself and potentially radiate low energy, or what he ended up doing, which was being sort of like a hyper bunny, going way too far the other way to contradict the rumors of being low energy, and he looked completely insane. So Trump was able, and lying Ted about Ted Cruz, crooked Hillary, simple tags they found very hard to struggle.
Yeah, he was very good at that.
He's a brilliant marketer. Mm-hmm. He knows how to sell things. He knows how to market things, and he knows how to do it in a very damaging way to opponents. And he is look, he always said to me, people want me to change, because I said, why don't you dial down the Twitter rhetoric a little bit? Just try to be a little bit more appealing to middle America, to the independents perhaps who are not like diehard MAGA fans. And he said, why should I dial down anything? I've become the president of the United States, despite being the most underqualified candidate in history. Why should I change? I've just beaten, he said, the most qualified candidate the country's ever seen, Hillary Clinton. I kept being told I was the least qualified, she was the most qualified, and I've beaten her to the White House. Why should I change who I am? And what you're seeing now, I totally agree with you about this with Trump. He's becoming the very thing he hates most, the biggest, sorest loser in the world.
Yeah, right.
And I've tried to tell him, this is just, you've got to leave 2020. Nobody cares. Everyone's looking forward to 2024. And if he was able to pivot, I think Trump's real problem.
Well, he's become his own mimic, right? Just this problem that we talked about to begin with is that people tend to fall into the image and then they can't escape from it.
And he loves doing the rallies where he has tens of thousands of people who, buy into his greatest hits of being what Donald Trump was in 2016. But I do think his real problem now is that he can't let it go. He can't let the past go. He keeps wanting to relitigate the 2020 election. And I think ultimately will cost him any chance of winning again. When in fact, if he'd been able to pivot slightly, I think he would have had a good chance. And I'll give another parallel. One of the reasons I fell out with him in the pandemic period was when he said that, from the presidential podium, that you should use bleach, household bleach, to zap the virus out of your body, which is clearly a stupid and dangerous thing for a president to be saying of any country, let alone the United States of America, when so many people were dying. And he hated me saying that and unfollowed me on Twitter, which, given he only followed 50 accounts, was quite a big deal. And when he rang me eventually to sort of seal peace a few months later, just before the election, I said to him, do you mind if I just speak frankly to you? He said, sure. I said, look, the thing you've lacked this year, and it may be you just don't have this valve, so be honest with me, but you've lacked empathy. You've lacked empathy over the pandemic. You've made it all about yourself and the stock market crashing and made it look like you're taking it all personally. You haven't been the comforter in chief. You don't seem to have that tool in your armory. You just want to be the strong commander in chief. I said on the George Floyd killing, same thing. No real empathy for what a lot of Americans were feeling. And I said that lack of empathy is going to cost you because you're up against Joe Biden, who everybody knows from his own personal tragedies has huge amounts of personal empathy for people because he lost his wife and baby daughter in a car crash. He lost his son to a brain tumor. And I said, I just think you should show a bit more empathy. And it would go an awful long way. But then I watched him go out the next day and do some press thing, and he was just exactly the same as normal. So he sort of agreed with me on the call, but then wasn't able to deliver it. I don't think he really has an empathy valve.
Well, he capitalized on being disagreeable, which is part of what we've discussed through this whole show, is that if you're in the public eye like that, and you're a critic, and you want to say what you have to say, and you want to separate the wheat from the chaff, it's useful to be disagreeable. But you can't be disagreeable all the time. One of the things that happens to people as they mature, maybe they start out disagreeable, but as they become more sophisticated, they're able to incorporate agreeable and compassionate virtues and skills into their personality. And then they can use them when that's necessary, and they can be disagreeable when necessary. And then you have a personality that's extremely broad and capable of dancing with every situation. And so I do see, it does look to me like this is an Achilles heel for Trump, this tendency to devolve into a very effective but somewhat juvenile bullying. And an inability, and then combined with that, this proclivity to play the victim, which I really think is stunningly off-brand for him. I can't see that that's going to be a successful ploy because it leaves everyone on the conservative side in the same position that the radicals on the left want to put conservatives, which is to abandon all faith in the credibility of institutions. And then what do you have? All you have is blind faith in the leader. And then, of course, the leftists criticize that for being the worst of populism. And in some sense, they've got a point. Now, I think in Trump, the leftists and the liberals, for that matter, had a large hand in creating their own monster because they chewed on him so hard and were so... I especially saw this with the Abraham Accords, because when the Abraham Accords, which brought a fair bit of peace to the Middle East, for those of you who are listening who don't know, a historic signing of a peace accord between Israel and a number of Islamic states, Muslim states, Morocco and among them, and Sudan and the United Arab Emirates and others, with the Saudis apparently fully on board, although not exactly signing the treaty. This happened when I was ill and I didn't pay much attention to it, but when I recovered and I saw what had happened in the Abraham Accords, it just floored me that this had received almost no attention and no credit, because it's a really big deal. And so the devil was never given his due in Trump's situation. And I think that made him a much bigger devil than he would have otherwise been.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I always said that. I wrote about 120 columns for the Daily Mail US website about Trump during his presidency. And after he left, I worked out about half of them had been supportive of things he'd done or said, and half of them were critical. And I felt that was a much more accurate take, actually, on the Trump presidency. A lot of the things he did, albeit delivered often with very blunt and unappealing rhetoric, were right. You know, he was right about a lot of things. He was absolutely, has been proven right about Europe's over-reliance on Russian energy. Completely proven right about that. He was right about a lot of European countries not paying their proper dues to NATO. And he was completely correct to call them out on that. I think he was right in many things that he did. The problem with Trump was...
Well, he was right to call out the sanctimony of the Democrats
Yes, and there's no doubt he did get treated in a ridiculously over-the-top way by his opponents. There's also no doubt he fueled that by constantly going into battle with them. My real problem with Trump on the rhetoric was not that he could be blunt and aggressive. It was when people like Colin Powell or John McCain died, just basic instincts should tell you, if you've got nothing good to say, probably don't say anything, right? Because these were two American war heroes, regardless of politics. And he came out on both occasions within 24 hours and criticized them in tweets as they were basically a few hours dead. And I felt that was just unbelievably graceless. And I don't think most Americans are graceless. I just don't think they are, in my experience. And I think that would have grated was a lot of Americans who may have been tempted to go with Trump's policies, but just thought the guy how can you do that? It's just not American to do that, I don't think. So he lets himself down a lot, actually, with stuff like that. But you shouldn't, I don't think we should move away from the fact a lot of his instinctive gut feeling about policies were correct. And I could see a situation where someone like DeSantis, the governor of Florida, ends up winning the Republican ticket because he basically pursues Trumpian policies, but without all the stupid rhetoric and the silliness and the scandalous stuff which goes with being Donald Trump. And he might well end up being president. A presidency Trump could have won if he'd looked back at his first 4 years in office and pivoted to something more agreeable. Instead, he's done what you and I said at the start of this interview. He's made the mistake of going back to what he was before and tried to replicate it.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems too, which is quite surprising for someone who's as sales-oriented as Trump, and perhaps this is maybe a sign of exhaustion, because it could be, is that he hasn't formulated a positive vision. It's all predicated on this idea of corruption and theft. And as I said, that casts him as a victim, which isn't a good look for him at all, or for his supporters. I've been quite surprised because I've had a lot of interactions with conservative politicians in the United States and Canada and throughout Europe. And it is difficult for conservative types to generate a positive vision because they tend to stand for tradition. And it's not that easy to generate a compelling, forward-looking story when you're fundamentally reliant on tradition. It can be done, but it's very difficult. But it's sad and upsetting to see that Trump hasn't been able to reinvent himself for this next election. And I do think that one of the best possible outcomes might be that DeSantis can take some of the energy that Trump generated and move forward in somewhat the same manner with less of the juvenile overlay.
Yeah, the key thing I'd say about DeSantis, which I've noticed, apart from the fact his resume is very impressive. This guy went to Yale and Harvard Law School. He was the senior legal counsel to the commander of SEAL Team 1 in Fallujah during the Surge, which was the year that America lost most of its soldiers in that war. He's an incredibly well-qualified guy. He also has a strong personality, but he has a respect for the system. He has a respect for the presidency. When Biden has had to deal with him on disasters and things, there's a mutual respect there, which I just never saw with Trump, really. He would rather shoot himself than be like that. And I think that he has a respect for the office. I think if DeSantis lost an election, he wouldn't spend the next few years claiming it had been stolen. So I think that he has a respect for democracy, which Trump doesn't have. Trump has a respect for it as long as he's winning.
Yeah, well, so that's a example of putting not yourself, but the principles for which you stand forward. And it is necessary, if you're a politician, to have due respect for the institutions and traditions that you serve, because they are larger than you. And if you don't believe that they're valid, although they need to be modified in the details, if you don't believe that they're valid and they gave rise to you, then there's an internal contradiction there that's not trivial. And so, well, it'll be interesting to see if the Republicans can negotiate this through the next election cycle coming up very, very quickly without shooting themselves in the foot over the schism in the Republican side over Trump. So I guess we should probably bring this to a close. We've been talking for as long as we're supposed to talk. And so it's good to end, I think, on the DeSantis note and to end with that analysis